Welcome to the Diversity Pivot Podcast. I'm your host, Julie Kratz, and this season we will be unpacking real trends, hot topics in the workplace around allyship and inclusion. Our goal is that each week you leave with tangible tools, information, practical strategies that you can take back to allies at your organization. Let's dig in to this week's topic. Hello, listeners. We've got Rachel Ceccarelli with us rather today. And I'm so excited for you to meet her because she has over 15 years of experience in communications and at public companies. And she currently serves as the Vice President of Engagement at DHI Group based in Denver, Colorado. And she helps advance diversity and inclusion initiatives, drives employee engagement through training and cultural initiatives, and oversees programs that create an equitable and attractive workplace for DHI employees. She's held a bunch of different roles before this one, including communications, public relations, investor relations, corporate communications, and has also worked in marketing. Early in her career, she worked as a university liaison at the Colorado Technical University and began her professional journey as a reporter. Her career reflects that robust commitment to strategic communication, stakeholder engagement, and a strong emphasis on inclusion. Welcome to the show, Rachel.
Thank you so much for having me. I love being here.
What a cool background, like that career ladder, kind of lots of different roles, lots of different functions. It's exciting to see that in action.
Yeah.
Tell our listeners, how did you find your way into the inclusion work?
Yeah, so I started my career has been predominantly around communications and working at I've been at my company for 14 years and have held a lot of different roles, as you just said. And one of the things I started working on more and more was internal communication. And after you're doing internal communication, after a while, you just realize it's really about getting to the heart of employees. What do they need to know? What are they giving for feedback? And what's important for them to do their jobs. And so in that internal communications role, I became much closer to our HR department and team and have since been part of the HR team, which has been really wonderful, and learning about what our team does. And I think a lot of what we do is really just around feedback. And so when we talk about DEI, it's just so much of it is focused on feedback and listening to employees and people and what they feel, and then finding a way as a company to implement, and take action.
Totally. I like that focus feedback. And when you think about equity, having equitable access to feedback, having your voice be heard, people actually listening to you, I mean, it really amplifies the inclusion piece as well. Yeah, Rachel, I wonder kind of from your position, we know DEI is getting, a lot of flack in the news cycle and boycotts and bans and all sorts of silly stuff. What do you think is causing that?
I think it's just a matter of people not understanding what DEI really is. I think people who don't understand it are thinking that it is creating for other people an inequitable path, or having people who may not have qualifications to get into these roles if there's considered what they call a DEI hire, all of that stuff. But what it really means is companies, and good companies hopefully doing it this way, is that you're creating an environment where everyone feels like they have access and that everyone feels like they could work there. At our company, we did a lot of work around our hiring process and looking at how we're attracting candidates and doing things that just make it so that anyone who is qualified for the job could apply for it and feel like they could work at this company. And it was things like removing certain words that are more geared towards one population or another. It's simple stuff like that that just made it so that it was more of a level playing field for everyone to have access. That's really what DEI is about. It's that everyone should feel included and feel like they have the same work environment and access to the same opportunities as anyone else.
Totally, totally, yeah. I like that DEI is about access and it's not about decreasing someone's access to increase someone else's. And that's where I think the zero sum game mentality, I win, you lose, DEI just doesn't work that way. So it's really about creating opportunities for everyone, even in the hiring process, using more, gender neutral language and non-triggering language and metaphors just makes it easier for the right candidates to find their way to the job. That makes it better for everyone. So I really appreciate you saying that. Yeah, thinking about your career and thinking about the importance of feedback, being prepared to listen and take action while also recognizing limitations. Let's be honest, resources, budgets, I'm not seeing those necessarily decrease. They're just getting more embedded inside existing budgets. There's kind of like that DEI line item just kind of like gets put in somewhere else. I'm curious how you use feedback and also manage a budget because we can't give everybody everything they want when we get that feedback too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the, for a company that may not have this, and these are very commonplace in companies, but maybe you're a smaller company, maybe you have more stretched resources, maybe you don't have a program that is, DEI related right now. But what we did at our company a couple of years ago, and by no means trailblazers here, but we created employee resource groups. And what employee resource groups do is they create in our company a shared space for people who had shared experiences and backgrounds and made it so that they had a place where they could talk to one another and then give valuable feedback back to us as an organization. And I think that the employee resource groups, there were these, we talk to employees all the time. We have feedback mechanisms in place. We have places for people to submit anonymous questions. We have an annual engagement survey. And so it's not that we weren't getting the feedback throughout the year, but it wasn't until we created these employee resource groups where people who had that same shared background and started talking about it and saying, I'm also experiencing this kind of issue. A really good example of that is that we had our Pride group come together and talk about how they're having a hard time finding mental health resources in some of the areas that they lived because the healthcare providers may not be versed in LGBTQIA plus issues or may not have a total deep understanding of that. Whereas, other parts of the country, there may be people who are more versed in that. And so after talking to that Pride group about that, we said, okay, so our healthcare provider, our benefits kind of limit that because traditional mental health is that you need to have a provider who's in state with you. And so what we said was, let's take it away. And we ended up offering teletherapy for all of our team members across the organization. Now, that was an expense as a company. We had a budget for that, of course. It didn't happen overnight, but it was something that one group told us, and it ended up benefiting the whole population because any employee can then use teletherapy and find a provider that may be more in tune to their needs. And we wouldn't have found that out had we not
Right.
had that conversation with one of the employee research groups. So when we do things at our company, and I think other companies need to think about this too, is as you were saying, the DEI line item, what it really should be is this creating inclusivity for all team members and
Mhm.
creating that kind of the equitable environment for all. Because what works for some is probably going to work for all. So it
Yeah.
just benefits you to do that.
Yeah, it reminds me, Rachel, of the curb cut effect. When we cut curbs for folks, that was intended for wheelchair users to begin with, we made it better for people with strollers and bikes. And so, yeah, what works for some generally works better for all when it's done inclusively. So, great point there. Um, I think it's just so important to be intentional with that feedback. And you mentioned employee resource groups. And it's a very affordable way. There really doesn't have to be a budget. There's time, and I would argue that people should be compensated for that time, or they should have other work come off their plate to do that work. But I don't see employee resource groups going away. I just had a client call today, and they're like, we're in Texas, and there's a lot of DA pushback and legal challenges, but we're still doing it. we're just
Mhm.
talking about it differently. And so they have a people of their company that's an employee resource group that's really leading the way. And they're just not using the acronym as much because of legal concerns, which is very sad and quite honestly ridiculous. But that is the reality right now. So I think for folks listening, if you're feeling that pressure, employee resource groups are not going away. They're not. And I'm seeing more and more of them getting started, right? And a lot of times it's gender and race to start, but like you said, a pride group, an LGBTQ plus group, disabilities, et cetera. There's lots of different avenues for employees to feel involved in it in a very cost effective way. So very, very good. What else are you seeing as far as like if you kind of looked at a DEI and inclusion of what's worked at your organization, what hasn't worked.
Yeah. I think one of the other things we do is especially if you are in a budget restrictive environment, these employee resource groups can also serve as your, in some cases, training. They can serve for training purposes. Now, that's not always the purpose, right? And we've definitely heard from some of our groups too that we're not here to only educate, we're here to take action as well. And of course, that's when we say exactly, we're here to take your feedback and put it into action as well. But using some of these groups with, of course, their permission and like with them leading the charge and feeling really empowered, doing things like trainings around certain issues or concerns, understanding what's happening in their environment and sharing it with all employees. I think we talked a little bit about why there's pushback. Some of it's just misconception. And when another team member who may not understand DEI hears it from their peer who they work with day in and day out, they're like, oh, okay, this makes more sense to me because I'm seeing it exactly from Joe, who I work with. And Joe saying it that way puts it into such better perspective for me. So I think using those people who are, day in and day out living that, and then using it for educational purposes and training is really important because, it's the person that's helping you along the way.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes it relatable. That's why allyship is so important. When you see something you do, something you say, an action you take impact someone else positively that you care about, it's a big deal. Like that feeling of being helpful to somebody is a very primal human need. Rachel, another challenge a lot of companies are struggling with right now is how to get allies engaged. They'll quite frankly will tell me I can't get white men to come to our ERG programs or the senior leaders don't show up. And it's really harmful because it signals it's not important. And I think I get the perspective of white men. They're like, well, that's not for me. I'm not supposed to be there. There's still, unbelievably, 2024, still that perception that DEI work is for somebody else. So what have you seen as far as getting traction with allies?
Yeah. What you said there with leaders not joining, that's right there. It has to come from the top. Our CEO and our senior leadership team is fully invested in, I say DEI, but really just inclusivity. They're fully invested in making sure that their team members know that they're there for them. They're there for support. They're all allies of all parts of our organization. And so if you don't have that engagement from your leadership team, it's going to be an uphill battle. So I think that's probably just primarily working with the senior leadership team so that they know how important it is to the people on their team that they can see that their leader believes in this. And allyship is, I think even in our organization, we go back and forth, we talk about allyship a lot, that people don't maybe understand how to be an ally. They don't know what necessarily allyship means to them. So we have a lot of education around in a situation where it's like using the right pronouns and calling people in and having conversations about how you can be a good ally. Our allyship group this month, we do have an allyship group, and in September is going to be focusing on recovery awareness. And so, we talk about inclusivity. Inclusivity is not just gender, it's not just race, right? Inclusivity can also be remote work, hybrid talent. How do people feel like they are included in the organization at the same level as everybody else? And so, I do think allyship is one of those things where people don't know what they don't know. And so it really does take other people to say, here's how you can be an ally to me. And here's some things that you can do to learn about allyship on your own. And I can be here to be a support and a resource for you. But it's a matter of allyship is the person taking the action to be the ally too, and saying, okay, I want to learn about this and learn about the differences that are between us.
Yeah. Yeah, luckily, when I first started doing allyship work, there weren't a lot of books or tools out there, but and this is relatively the surge since 2021 when it was dictionary.com, I think, had allyship as the word of the year. It's really seen a lot of growth, a lot more books, TED Talks, etc. So there's plenty of resources, allies. If you are listening to this, there is a lot of ways that you can self-educate because, like you said, the ERGs, then the burden of education falls back on them. And it's like, wait, I'm already marginalized and now I have to do the education too. So it's like that kind of double bind that we put folks in. There's tools that you can absolutely leverage. Um, and I think it's so important, like you said, with the senior leaders. I had a client recently, we had their full senior leadership team gets together quarterly for a few days. And so we carved out like a nice 2 hour slot, which, I wanted a whole day, but you get 2 hours. So what can you do? But, it's typical demographics of a leadership team, 70, maybe 80% white men. Sadly, two people of color, I think, in the room. So maybe 10% and a couple women. So anyway, all that to say, going in, you just never know how this is going to land. And you inevitably, what I find is have a few, just usually a few, one or two with the arms crossed and the, grumpy look on their face. But what's really interesting is you talk about allyship, and DEI is a part of that, but like talking about allyship and how you personally can be more inclusive as a leader and get more out of your team. Not that you're doing it for that reason, but you do that the body language shifts. They start to like lay their hands down, and their grumpy face turns into a slightly smiling face, and you get feedback like that wasn't so bad. It's like, so yeah, we joke it's like getting people to eat their vegetables and like it, but there is an art to this, and it's kind of that two-pronged that you said. You have to be willing to self-educate, see this is a part of being a leader, and that's not a position, that's just anyone as a leader. And then also, you know, like you said, attend, be an active ally for folks in your network as well. And so that education participation balance, I think, is really important. Rachel, when you think about the future for DEI, aside from the political backlash we talked about, what do you see on the horizon?
Yeah, I do think what's going to be happening more with DEI is people are going to be looking at DEI broader than what I think they think it is today. We talked about it a little bit, like, equity and inclusion. Diversity is not just diversity from race, from gender, sexual orientation. It's diversity of thought. It's diversity of, like I said, the way people are working, especially in the world with remote work. That is a different way that people are working. And therefore, there's differences between remote workers and hybrid workers and in-office workers. Like all this kind of stuff can be included in that idea around diversity. And so I think that would help the cause of people thinking about the things as differences and how we bring people together so they don't feel left out. And, yes, there's pushback, especially around equity, in some cases. And I think that really just does come from misunderstanding. It's not that, that you're, like you said, taking away from another group. You're giving more to all to make sure that everybody feels like they have that space. So I do think that equity, there needs to be so much more education on that. And I hope that's what we do see more in the future of understanding what equity is, more education, more resources around that, because you can't really get to inclusion without addressing equity. It kind of jumping ahead a couple of steps by doing that.
Yeah, I know. When Sherm pulled the E out of DEI this summer, gosh, it had everyone in an uproar, and well, the pro DEI folks anyway. But
Yeah.
I kind of, yeah, I totally agree with you. You can't foster an inclusive environment if you're not equitable with who you include. And so it's like this chicken and egg problem. But for some reason, like you said, misunderstanding equity feels like a zero-sum game or whatever it is in people's minds. it's just something, I think one of the things that people really struggle with is that, like you said, they don't know what they don't know. Like if you haven't had the lived experience, it's very difficult to really understand unless you're really willing to empathize. And this isn't riveting stuff to do. I don't want to read about the terrible problems of racism. I mean, that is not something that's enjoyable, but it's important that I
Mhm.
know about that because I haven't experienced it before as a white person, at least not in the context that a black or brown person would, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering, there's all these education programs, all these books, there's all these things, but like, what do you think it'll take for people to get over? How do people get over it? Do you think it's possible?
I think that, when you're in your bubble, you're comfortable in your bubble, you're not bothered, you're not having to hear about that stuff. And so when people start poking holes in it, that's where the problem is. When people start saying, you need to hear this, you need to learn about this. Like you are sitting next to somebody who has this lived experience. And I think that's what it really comes down to is breaking those barriers and those people who are in the bubble and feeling they can stay in the bubble. It's like you can't stay in the bubble. We are all part of this, especially in companies, like especially in organizations. There's too much work to be done to have that be a focus where you can't get the work done. And so I mean, I do believe that, that the more that people are around people of diverse, like around different environments, they are choosing to be in spaces that don't look the same. Like they're not. Everyone doesn't look like them. I think it can help. I mean, maybe that is a little rose-colored glasses, but it's not like something that we can just turn off and say, okay, we did our best. We're just gonna stop here. No, it's constantly needing to be work, and it's really just for people to be around, like I said, especially in companies that don't look like them, that don't have the same background, that don't have the same experiences of learning
Yeah.
from them.
Yeah, no, totally. And diversity is just a fact. Like it or
Yeah.
not, it's coming. And like you said, in organizations, it's coming much more quickly, especially with Gen Z surpassing baby boomers in the next few years. So when people tell me like I'm anti-DEI or I don't like that DEI stuff, it's like, well, it's happening. So you can either, like you say, get out of your bubble, get out of your own way, or stay in your bubble until it eventually cracks. So
Yeah, I mean, there are probably companies that may not put as much of an emphasis on that. You were talking about some clients earlier, and there may be other companies that don't put as much of an emphasis on DEI, and maybe they don't even put it in any of their, in marketing materials or employee engagement. And so maybe that for that person who wants to stay in their bubble, that's the place that they should go and look at. But I think over time, I mean, companies that do focus on DEI have more diverse voices, diversity of thought, and it's just better for business because you are not having sameness. Sameness is boring and it doesn't help move anything forward.
totally, totally. Well said. Well said. Well, you've left us with so many great nuggets, Rachel. I really appreciate the work you're doing, whether it's how to handle the pushback, how to get more allies, how to really get feedback and get your employee resource groups activated. Tell our listeners, though, what's one thing you wish they'd walk away with learning today?
Yeah, I think that real DEI embraces the differences in people, that recognizes equity is essential to moving forward as a culture, and that inclusivity is not just a word, but it has to be put in practice and, use that feedback. And as anybody who may feel stuck or may feel like they don't have a place for that feedback, keep pushing through, keep finding the people who are going to listen to you, keep talking to the right people in the organization and giving that feedback because it does pay off and it pays off for everyone.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We gave some great examples of that. Well, excellent. Tell our listeners how they can follow your work.
Yep. So you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm Rachel Ceccarelli. There may be a couple of us, but I'm Rachel Ceccarelli at DHI, and DHI is the parent company of Dice.com and clearancejobs.com. So that's where you can find me. And you can follow DEI's or DHI's social channels on Instagram, and we're on LinkedIn. So yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, wonderful work that you're all doing. Shout out to DHI and your leadership.
Thank you so much, Julie.
Thank you for listening to the Diversity Pivot podcast. My hope is that you walked away with a tangible tool, insight, or information that you can share with other allies on the journey. If you liked this week's episode, please leave us a review. Your feedback means a tremendous amount to us. We'll be back next week with another hot topic.